Welcome to the Multilingual Computing Winter Series. This is Winter Series number 1. I'll be your host. And we have the good people from Multilingual standing by, helping along with this webinar. And today, I have two very dear guests. I hope in the industry that you know them. If you don't know them and you're just meeting them for the first time, they are two of the people who are you should know in the organization. So I'm just going to introduce them briefly. On my list here, first is Searle. Loy is the Senior Director of Localization and Content at Workday. And Loy has been a past president of Women in Localization. She's on the board, as is Silvia. Silvia is the head of localization at Juniper Networks. And I know both of these very fine people for quite a number of years, just being in the industry, meeting at conferences, and working together as well at various companies in the past. So we have a bit of a relationship, and I hope to bring you all as audience members into that just a little bit. And of course, we're all coming from our respective COVID hidey holes. I'm actually in the office today to get a better connection and all that. All right, so we're going to go in very briefly. I'm going to share a screen just to get the customer questions going. And I want to mention that the format of this webinar is that I'm going to ask, I've got 10 questions together here, and I'm going to ask these 10 questions. We're going to go through them one at a time. But to make this webinar really good, I'd like you to stay on for the whole thing and ask your questions also. We're going to spend a good deal of time at the end devoted to your questions, never mind my questions. And I'm hoping that the conversation gets some things going in your mind. Because the human brain works the way it does, I always ask people to write down your questions right away. So instead of waiting, write your question down right away. It doesn't have to be in perfect English or anything. Send it either through the questions interface or the chat interface in Zoom. And one of our good friends at Multilingual will then take care of asking those questions or repeating those questions off for us, and we'll get to them. I want to also mention, because everybody, this is like the most popular question for any webinar is, yes, a recording is being made of this and there will be recording access. So just a heads up, we're going to get started here. All right, so the first question, well, it's not even a question. This isn't even something for our audience. I'm going to mention, just so we have a little bit of ground rules here, when I talk about globalization, that means a lot of different, it's a really loaded word. It means a lot of different things to people. Sometimes people use globalization, meaning I'm going to outsource my engineering halfway around the world, right? Or it's people protesting in the street. There's a lot of emotion around the world. But for our purposes, we're talking about the adaptation of technology, products, content, marketing, and customer outreach to targeted locales. So I want to, focus on that role. It should be kind of near and dear to everybody in this audience. All right. So my first question, and then I'm going to switch off this presentation view, is I recently saw this tweet. If you don't follow Val Afshar, you should. He's really good at this kind of stuff. He listed the 10 trends on the minds of CEOs. And what stuck out to me is there's nothing about globalization on there. It was like buzzword central, but nothing about globalization. And I wondered, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So I'm going to turn it over to Silvia and Lloyd to answer that question.
Adam, I'm not surprised. If you look at 2020, that was a very unusual and difficult year for CEOs. And it's amazing that we have a vaccine now as quickly as we did, but we're not out of the woods. And I saw some reports that we're going to be feeling the after effects for 10 years. So CEOs had to worry about keeping their business afloat. They had to reinvent how they were doing many things. They had to accelerate their digital transformation years ahead, overnight. And, how their employees would work from home and continue business. There was also worry about the employees' mental and physical health, worry about burnout. So many things happening in their own lives because they were home too with their families. They worry about their own families. So I'm not surprised. And I don't think I saw the same report, but what I hear that it's in the mind of CEOs is a lot of going back to the basics, because it's very hard to add new logos. So it's about keeping the ones that you have and sort of upselling to them. And yeah, maybe globalization, it didn't pop up as in the top trend, but there is a silver lining. It's very well and alive. It's kicking for the industries that weren't so affected by the pandemic, like the travel industry, cruise hotels, all those that had the most impacted. We have seen growth in the globalization, but maybe we're not adding new languages, but we are adding more content to the ones that we already have. We're doing different things like events, virtual events that we never done in the past, and we had to localize them. I don't know, Lloyd.
So I agree, and I would add maybe a couple things. I think one is you could argue that maybe globalization has become somewhat ubiquitous. I think that companies now expect to go global. Even little startups often expect to go global, certainly in the tech space. So there's a part of this that perhaps might be, no longer a special call out because it's assumed. So there's one theory. My other theory is if you just consider, especially in the US, so the political climate this last year, globalization in terms of your, it's a highly loaded word. I think for many parts of America, when they think globalization, they don't think about our industry. They don't know about our industry at that level. They think globalization is offshoring our jobs and that kind of thing. So I think that could be a factor of it as well. Like, this is not the year to be talking about that. So I think it's both ubiquitous, it's becoming a norm, it's becoming a standard. And I think the broader, more casual use of that word creates a dynamic around it that it might not show up as much for a while.
Right. And that's why I said, is this a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, the thing I think of is like, at least in some windows of tech, it's like, well, of course you're global. It's 2021, so which I consider a good thing. The other side that you both kind of brought out, but particularly Silvia, is that there is a lot of maintaining right now. The emphasis, I think, from what I saw in my business world, was the emphasis in the first half of 2001 up until Q4, really. What I saw with our own customers for software technology and services around continuous globalization was that there was a lot of focus on holding on, like we don't know what's happening here. Mm-hmm. It's not the time to be bold, right? And then all of a sudden people said, hey, at least in tech, the world isn't ending. I mean, if your tech was supporting the restaurant industry, I think it was a different kind of story, right? But if your tech was supporting HR in the enterprise, for instance, it's kind of like a different forward look going on. So that's what I saw. And I always, like, to my friends, I tell them that our business is often very much a window on the future of the economy when it comes, like specifically Lingoport, just because we're so involved with internationalization. And most of our customers already internationalize, and it's a matter of maintaining. But we get a certain amount that come to us and say, hey, we've got this application. We've never internationalized it. We know it's a big job. We want help, right? You don't enter into that unless you've got a perspective of 2, 3, 4, 5 years out, right? And people don't feel comfortable in that perspective unless they start thinking, hey, we're coming out of that. And so that is very much on the upswing. So that's my little window on the world. All right. Going to go to the next question. Sorry, it takes me a second to get this back up on the screen here. What's the latest in terms of how you perceive globalization is embraced by managers? So now we're going for a big industry thing down to like your world.
I can start with this. I have two views on this. I think it has almost everything to do with where the company is in the global life cycle, how mature the company is in going global. So if a company is still working up to that glorious 50% mark where half of the revenue is coming from the world, up to that point or up to close to that point, I don't think global usually is as important. It's just not, it's seen as gravy or icing, you know, it's that extra thing. It's cool, it's fun, but it's not critical. It's not important. I think when you start getting closer to that midway mark is when global starts to take on a corporate-wide urgency and focus. So I think that is a factor of kind of how it's perceived by the company. I think there's another space that happens once it's mature. So once you're well over the 50% and you've reached a level of maturity and all your products are out there, your marketing's out there, the critical content's out there, you have people and boots on the ground in all the places you want them. When you get to that place, there's we're really important in that about maybe that 35 to 55 space, like what we do really, really, really matters. Suddenly we are under the microscope. When you get past that, I think the thing that happens is people just think it's magically done. Oh, isn't that just machine translations? Oh, I thought just machines did that. So I think the flip side of that is when it finally starts working so smoothly, everyone just assumes that there's magic behind it and nobody's really having to do anything. And so then there's a profound underrating that happens. So unless things blow up, it's just seen as underwear. It's stuff we don't care about. It's good that you have it, but we don't care. We don't want to see it. That's my crazy thought.
Okay, I'll add a few things.
It's underwear. Okay.
It's underwear. That's my metaphor. We are underwear. We are, and generally not Victoria's Secret underwear. So it's usually not that important that people see it.
Love it. Okay, so I will also say it depends what industry you are. Some industries are more focused on it than others. If you're B2B or B2C, also matters. If it's part of your company culture. If it is, then it's great because then everybody has to embrace and it makes our job so much easier. How close you are with the managers that you are trying to persuade. The closer you are, they see the results and they become believers. And once they become believers, they come back and they spread the word and make others come. It's beautiful when you get those people to trust that it works and it's needed. But it takes time, it takes caring, a lot of education.
All right, very good. So I guess the way I look at this is in one way, in one case, you're looking to be a utility, and in another case, you're also building that relationship so that they appreciate it. All right. When it comes to organizations and globalization, what gets in the way? This is the da-da-da music comes on right here. Do you get a lot of technical-oriented objectors, for example, from development teams, and how do you meet those technical objections? So those are just two examples, but you just like, what are the objections and how do you deal with them?
You want to start, Silvia, or shall I?
Go for it, Lori.
Okay. I think there's two things that get in the way, at least in my experience, the most. I think the first thing is economics. So if there isn't a budget, if there isn't a plan, if there isn't actually a bag of money to do the work, that can be in the way. And oftentimes that's the first thing that's in the way. I think the second thing that I've seen that's often in the way of this is the mindset of let's release it in English first. Let's release it in the US first. Let's let the thing marinate in our core markets before we go global. And I think that's one of the greatest flaws in terms of ultimately getting to higher revenue faster, better, as well as one of the flaws to actually designing a good product. So once it's hardened, and it's been in the US market for a couple of years, then all the things you need to do to make it right globally are a much bigger lift. Whereas if you put global in at the start, you include global customers in your beta or your early adopters or your early approach, the likelihood that you will actually deliver a global product rather than a US product that then just gets translated is greater. And the tech debt that you inherit downstream for what wasn't properly internationalized, all that good stuff, much better to do it upstream, do it right, and have that get into the DNA of the company of this is how we do things. We make an assumption that everything we're going to do probably at some point in its life cycle is global. So we start that way from the start. Those are the two things I see in the way. Money and the US first mindset that requires reset.
Yeah, and to add to this, if you're lucky like me to join a company that has been in the market for over 2 decades and has really old code and it didn't internationalize from day one, it becomes very, very difficult to do so, because when you're trying to localize a product and you have such an old and big code, it's very expensive. And to prove the ROI, at the end of the day, adding a language is just another feature. And you're competing with features that may be, your life depend on them, because competitors have them. You're becoming obsolete if you don't do it. So, okay, it would be nice to have a language, but if we don't do this feature, guess what? We're losing US customers too. And you're constantly competing in this battle. You want to do, it's the right thing, but then comes along a feature that it will affect not only your global customers as well as your local ones, your US customers, and all the customers that speak English. So it's very, very difficult. The old the company is, and because you have to retrofit, and it's a beautiful thing. Again, if you get from the beginning, like Loy mentioned, very difficult when you're an established company.
Mm-hmm.
Silvia, you're playing my song. I'm going to just add, this is my own peeve, okay? But it, take from it and get charged from it that. Rightly so, a UX team will really struggle over, do I make this background blue or not, right? And that's actually really important, and it's about keeping up. And so we also have all these little features that are added continuously to sort of delight the customer, right? And then on the other hand, I see localization teams, because the plumbing, so to speak, of localization is difficult. They'll localize maybe twice a year or maybe 4 times a year, right? Because the plumbing is hard, and that just shouldn't be in this in this day and age, right? Like, why is localization a second-class citizen? So that's our marching orders, right? All right.
Why would we be waterfall when no one else is?
Right. Exactly. All right, and I would submit that the reason why we are waterfall when nobody else is because our organization still sort of is forced to manage projects in a waterfall, but that's a whole other conversation. So anyway, I want to get to our next question here. You both have working at companies that have technically oriented customers. So you're not making a little app that's going to have some cutie thing on the phone that's end user like average guy on the street or woman on the street facing. You're not developing Facebook, right? So are you still hearing that, hey, our users are all, they had to get their master's degree, or they got their, they're all degree, they had to learn English, they're all technical. Are you still hearing that?
Yes, I am. And the good news is that we're helping to change this. We're helping to change. And let me tell you a story that happened here. So for many years, we tried to localize the technical documentation, our product documentation here. And we would come and present, and it's very expensive to do. So we would hear no and no, customers can read in English, it's okay, let's not do it. Then finally, we came up with a plan, and we said, let's do a pilot, a small session, and we are going to do machine translation. And for the top, we look at analytics for the top most view documentation or topics, we will do post editing, but then the rest is going to be raw. And for those, we also want to test something. We want to publish. So we want to do a hybrid approach. We want to do some publishing where we have the pages and they have unique URLs. And we also want to do an API where it's on demand. So you click, you get it. If we're ready translated, we'll push from the repository. If we haven't translated, then it goes to the engine and it gets there in real time. And it's more work to pre-publish. It's a lot more work. And the bad news is that if you don't refresh in 3 months, in general, it gets old. So you have to pull all this again and publish. So why did we choose to do this hybrid approach? The reason is because that type of content is very, very friendly to SEO. They love it because it's dense in information. And we want to, besides other things, one of the things that we're trying to prove is that we would get good SEO results by doing that. And if we did, maybe we could get more of the attention that, so we're measuring, one of the things we're measuring is how many hits to our engine, how many people are visiting the pages, if they're using. So we're measuring usage, but we're also measuring the SEO value. And when we got the results back after about 3 months, we saw the first result. We saw a big bump on those pages that we had pre-published. And, one of the pages is Spanish. We also did Japanese and Chinese. And we're like, okay, maybe people are coming. They're very technical. They can read in English. But guess what? When they search, they're not going to search in English. They're going to search in their language. Mm-hmm. So there you go. We have this result to show. So when we went back to ask for more funding, to add more languages, or to do more training, more post editing, the first answer was no, because we're just showing the usage. We're like, look, we're getting so many people, so many hits. So we redid the presentation, went back, and then we saw the SEO value, and then they got interested. So I don't know if we change our story, and we show them that, yeah, maybe they can read in English, and maybe they will go back and forth because a lot of it is machine translation, so they will switch back and forth. But when they search, they will come through our site using their own keywords. Mm-hmm. And not English. Yeah. So, and that way we were able to get more funding, and we're doing a lot more now. We're adding more languages this year.
I love that, changing minds with data. I would add a couple things to this. I think, if I look at my company, we have such a strength over time in building our business with what I call the English first multinationals. So a lot of where we've come from today is we have translated our products, but we've not always done that last mile that makes it truly right for local customers. And or we might be missing markets. There's markets that we're not translating everything into. So I think about like the Netherlands. The Netherlands, the Nordics, there are certain markets where when you're in the business to business space are harder to get on the list to do that work. But we've really reached in our maturity that interesting space where our next opportunity is not English first customers who have global presence around the world and don't really care if their employees use, whatever products they implement in English or language, or they don't care deeply. The CEO looked at the list, saw all those languages checked off, was happy, and said, yes, we'll implement and buy this product. We're getting to the place where we're truly selling and truly supporting and standing up our product to global first customers. Customers that English is not their first language. That's not the language that they do all their business in. It's not the language, certainly, of the leadership of the company. And so that's a different beast. Even in the B2B space, that's a very different beast. And that requires that we actually look at language, and we look at language more deeply, and we step up. So I think that there's a certain amount of where are we in our life cycle, again, with the customers? Where are we with the maturity of our product, and where do we expect tomorrow's revenue? If we expect it coming from multinationals that are not US-based, well, then maybe we should translate Dutch, So it's like that kind of an answer. And I think the other piece of it is sectors. Some sectors of business, it's required. So if you're going to go into government, education, things like that, you definitely have to be in support of language. You might get away with it if it's a certain niche with, single users and, a certain space. But even those niches fall apart in some markets. So I think this is a maturity question as well as fit question.
All right. Well, our next question actually builds on that last question. That is, you started to go there, Roy, but that is, what markets do you find that localization is a must-have and why, and where is localization less important?
I can start on this one. I think there's a question too on localization, what we mean by that. The markets that to me are just a must-have are the markets for which nobody's looking at that English screen and can make any sense of it. So, Japan is obvious. Places like Russia, places like Korea. So I think, and then there's a secondary set of markets where you're looking at where there's perhaps legal requirements, so maybe French Canada to be in language. So I think you eliminate if they can't understand it, they won't buy it, which is pretty much a lot of the Asian languages and some of the Eastern European languages especially, and then compliance. But I think there's another piece on that, which is where is localization less important? And I think this goes more to is it just language? Because what we do from a language standpoint is actually I think it's the easy, most pragmatic lift. The harder lift is, does the product work? Is it an appropriate fit locally? So from a product localization standpoint, does the product work in all of those markets? So I think those two filters matter. And this is where you get away with like Dutch not being in language for a long time. Because it's generally a pretty good product fit and they get away with, they can read English, a lot of them. So it's a harder push to get to that level. That's my hit on that. What do you think, Silvia?
I think on the previous question and this one, you sort of touch most of the important points on this question. But I also would add that it depends on your business and its priorities. So maybe, my tier 1 languages will be different than yours. Juniper and Workday, for instance. It depends on the size of the market for your products, what's the competition is doing. I also like to look at English tolerance. I know you mentioned Japan and some others. It's interesting to look at the English tolerance levels for the country. The lower tolerance a country has for English, then the more you localize, and then you put all these things that Loy already mentioned and that I add into that formula in order to decide how much you're going to localize. But another thing that is interesting is that even when you're looking at tier 1 languages, you have differences in how deep you go, even within your tier 1 languages, right? So for us, for example, for Japan, we go much deeper. We do a lot more than what we do for German.
And I bet you that's true for almost everybody. For Japan, we always do a lot more in like every place I've ever worked. Yeah.
True.
Some markets are more demanding. Yeah. Also the space, consumer versus B2B, I think that makes a big difference because like the consumer space, you're going into language just so you can get the eyeballs. And, it's far more essential, I think, in that space than... Whereas in B2B, it's more about what drives the business.
Yeah, it's industry, revenue opportunity, potential ROI, all these things. Some ability to compete in RFPs.
Exactly.
Some of them you won't even be able to compete if your product is not localized.
Yep.
All right. So I just want to mention that I saw across the chat somebody asked a question. We'll get to that question after these questions. Really appreciate your questions, so keep them coming. All right. Now, while I get this next question up, I'll just mention, a few slides ago, Loy mentioned, gave the underwear metaphor. We all know, like many of us know, I should say, Renato Beninato talks about sort of the underwear principle of localization, which is that a lot of buying decisions are made while you're sitting at home researching something in your underwear is the idea. So language is a very informal, expected thing in terms of how people do their search. So let's talk about research. What kinds of, and Loy, I'm leaning on you because we've already even had this conversation. I have some good pearls here. Silvia, you may as well, but we haven't talked about this yet. What kinds of research do you call upon to gain budget and target a locale?
So for me, I think that you can't do this without a really good, deep partnership with your sales organization. So these numbers come from, usually the support numbers come from sales. So typically what I do when I go after a business case in order to get funding to grow the deliverable, grow our footprint, address a new market, is work with sales on what is the current revenue and what is the possible revenue. So what is the addressable market revenue in the various markets that we want to go into? So we see what's possible. So between the what's possible and what we currently have, there is a secondary relationship in there, which is how much will it cost? And at what point do you start to recognize that revenue? And there are other things that factor into it, like fit. So like there might be a fabulous worldwide addressable market that you could go after, but your product won't work in that market. So there's other stuff that needs to happen first. But typically you do language a good, 2-3 years before as the way to build the pathway towards having the customers come. So I think the most basic thing you start with is what is the current revenue compared to what is the possible revenue compared to your cost. And you look at those things over time. And you will make some assumptions, but you make those assumptions with the sales team on what is the revenue possible in year 1, year 2, year 3. And they usually want to grow. So they usually will help you build those numbers in a way that's rational for them. They will tend to be over conservative. So you want to also get finance and strategy on your side to help drive pretty good aggressive numbers so that your costs don't, so that they're not saying, oh yeah, if you spend $2 million, I can sell a couple thousand. Like, that's not the right formula. You need to make certain that the revenue numbers well eclipse what your costs are. That's my thought on that.
Well, I'm just going to poke at that a little bit. That is an internal bit of research.
Yes.
What happens externally in terms of research?
Externally, I think externally is a different beast. Because you definitely need to you have to go dumpster diving for similar type information about what is the addressable market in certain business sectors. You can find a lot online, but you will also find gaps. So I've done this in other places and found like fabulous information and then giant chasms and holes when it comes to certain markets or certain parts of a business sector. So some of it, you do what you can in that way. So you look across what's possible in the business sector that you're in globally. You look at competitors. You look at what are your competitors doing. These are the people that you compete with. What are they currently doing? So you are at least meeting the bar there, if not potentially being more aggressive. If you're in an interesting space where you have a lot of competitors, but they've not yet done that global thing yet, the opportunity to leapfrog is there. Harder to do that research, but it's possible, but the opportunity is so much greater. I think the other things that I've collaborated with strategy teams on are things like putting out really getting the information out there that you can collect SEO and see interest if you're not sure about markets, to see where you generate a lot of interest. And again, this takes a little time, and this takes actually getting that kind of information that would attract potential customers in the markets, getting that information in language. So you see who comes, and then you get a sense of, oh, wow, this is how this market looks really interesting. And then also you always kind of have to do a comparison against the English or perhaps whatever if your market is UK or US, against those markets. And it really helps if you have any historicals around when we first, this is English and how we track in English for the States, say. This is how we track in English for UK, say. And this is what we saw as the pattern when we first did French or when we first did Spanish. And you see at what point in time they start catching up and where their trajectory matches but is like a certain percentage lower. So you have that comparative measure. If you can get any of those comparative measures from the sales team, it gives you a really good way to say, in collaboration with them, okay, so these are 4 new markets we're looking at doing. If we look at when we first onboarded French and Spanish, we can probably expect this kind of time to market for us to actually see the revenue, and we could probably expect a similar trajectory there as a way of measuring it. You have to do some future casting to do this, and you probably don't have these data people on your teams. I've rarely had them on my team, so it's usually about partnering with the teams that have those resources, but asking the right kinds of questions for our domain so they can start tracking that information. Also, so important. When you start doing a language, start tracking your data before you do it. Get with sales to track the data before the language is added, so you have your starter benchmark. So if nobody captured it in the past because you weren't there, capture it starting going forward, because it will benefit you downstream for any additional languages and markets that you add. So that helps a lot, because then you can model.
Really good.
Yeah, and a lot of companies will have insight through IDC market research.
Exactly.
So, and you may not have the access, but like Lois said, you can partner with teams that can collect that information for you. So that's good. I also work in my company. The biggest part of my job is to do localization for marketing. So we also look at Forrester research for marketing trends and consumer behavior. That's another place that we look. Of course, web analytics, it can tell you where you're doing things right, the content that is very popular and you should do more, and also tells you what countries are visiting, so you can start seeing, okay, maybe that should be another language that we should add for the website, because we're seeing a lot of people that are coming to our site, and then you look at, outside of your company, all the things that Loy mentioned, and you look at what's happening inside, and you combine those two information, you're like, ooh. And then if on top of that, if you also look at some specific localization research from Common Sense Advisory or NAMSI, you can get a lot of data also on to help you prove points where you can get funding for what you're trying to do for your project.
All right, very good, very good. All right. So this next question we've mostly actually covered in that explanation. This is a chance to add anything. I'm going to poke at that just one more bit in that in the heat of the moment of answering these questions, none of you mentioned talking to customers or prospects.
I think that's this one.
There you go.
In the B2B space, it's super easy because your customers push you where they tell you you should go. I think B2B is easy because your customers will drag you into the markets that you need to go into and help guide the way. So I don't think that's a huge struggle in the B2B space. I think in the consumer space, this is where you start looking at what, if I think back to when I worked in more of a consumer space, they would actually look at the markets that were really engaged with our products, not in their language, or in other languages that they might speak that are secondary languages in their markets to figure out where to go next. We also looked at things like, so where were our customers already trying to consume our stuff and not even in their language, bless them. So that was always a factor. But I think the other piece that is a factor on this sometimes if you're a consumer is just how many speakers there are in different languages across the world. It's a very pragmatic math formula of like, these languages get you 50% of the world's speakers. These languages get you 80% of the world's speakers. These languages get you 95% of the world's speakers. So if you're in the consumer space, that can be a reasonable metric too. But B2B, we're lucky. I think our customers shoot us into the places we need to be.
Well, so just along those lines, when you're figuring that out, talking to a customer, you mentioned projecting forward, but in terms of cost, let's say you take on Catalan or something like that, for example. You have X number of speakers, so there's a formula. But you also have the formula of what is this going to cost me, even outside of the cost per word, because I think cost per word is not a great metric personally. What is this going to cost me as an organization to support this other language for is this a 3-year horizon, a 5-year horizon? Kind of what math goes into that?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. I've never seen a perfect solution for this. I don't know if you have, Silvia. I have roughly estimated for like new markets, like a 3-year return, because most companies don't have patience beyond that. So that's usually what I don't count year one because you're usually so busy just trying to do it and sales doesn't know what they're selling. So year one doesn't usually count. Year two, depending upon how long your sales cycle is, you might start to get some traction year 2. Year 3 usually is when you start to see some return. So I think, I've seen lots of different approaches on this, but in general, if I just do a wild swag, I will 3 years. Assume that 3 years they will come and 3 years they will have paid for the effort and that the customers coming will reimburse the ongoing, in essence, the ongoing maintenance effort of that work. But on our end, we also track how many customers are asking for specific languages. So if we've got one customer, and it's Icelandic, and there's not that many speakers, and they're one customer, that might be a place for machine translations. I don't know. That one's not going to drive a lot of business anytime soon. So it does help when you've got enough customers singing in chorus. I don't know. What would you say, Silvia?
You also have to say if you have the minimum to play before you enter a market. So,
yes.
Do you have an office? Do you have salespeople there? Do you have a partner? If you're for our products, we sell through partners. Do you have a partner? Have you get out of the way all the compliance? Are you allowed to sell? So you have to get this out of the way before you even consider, selling there.
Yeah. Although a lot of companies will go regional. They'll go regional, then see where the markets are, and then plant bodies after that. But yeah, we are just one of the costs. I do think that's one of the things is we are just one of the costs, and we are the easiest of the costs, I think, because we got numbers, we got data. We are a very simple, straightforward cost. The stuff that gets hidden under there is hiring marketing people, getting real estate, hiring salespeople, making the product right.
But it's still difficult to prove the ROI. It's still very, very hard for most of us. We can show research data, but they can always say no, but we also did this and we did that. There's so many things that happen in parallel that are not localization.
Yeah.
And how do you tie to localization? How do you tie that your language? Very difficult.
It is, and it requires that data to start. It requires that you know where you began so that you can measure it over time. Like if it's your very first language, a really hard. If it's the first language, you got nothing. If it's your third language, you at least should start to have some data to make your case.
All right. I saw a question asked during that. I was hoping somebody would pop up the Q&A thing. All right, good. All right, the next question. A lot of people employ all kinds of technology as part of, and that's what Lingoport does. So this is a question near and dear to my heart, but a lot of companies, sort of go through their own process and feel that they're unique in some way. And so the question of build versus buy, and this is just in general to all kinds of systems. I've even seen, Loy, you worked for a company like a million years ago that had its own localization team, right? So that was like extreme on one side of the spectrum. How do you deal with that? I mean, how do you deal with that equation internally, build versus buy? Because you can put a lot of brilliance and effort into that, or go and buy it off the shelf, and then there's sort of the acceptance of that outside technology. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
You want to go first, Sylvie?
I'll go. So I think it depends on your volume and needs. Like for us, our localization team, so far it has made sense for us to buy. We have a very small team. It's like we wouldn't be able to build anything from scratch. But I think it's great if you can customize a tool, and sometimes you have to or create from scratch and customize and make it unique for all your needs. But because sometimes that's the only option, there is nothing out there, so you have to create something from nothing, right? But then over time, a lot of times companies will see the opportunity because there is the need, and they will start creating tools, and maybe yours become very obsolete and expensive to maintain. And I'll tell you an example here. Our tech library has topics. It's kind of like data, but was made it in-house. And very old and very difficult to maintain and to learn. You have to give a lot of training for people to use it. difficult to connect with other tools that come along the way because it's unique. So there is no connector. So you have to create a connector to plug in other tools from scratch, right? Because there is nothing in the market. So you end up paying more money. In the end, we're moving to data now. We're moving away. We created this beautiful customized tool decades ago, and now we're finally moving to data. We're doing, Loy?
Bye. I think in the past, most of what we did was on-prem because that's kind of what we had. And if the tools weren't available to do what you needed to do, you'd build it, right? And then you keep feeding the baby and supporting it. And so I think the industry's moved into the cloud. I really firmly believe you go cloud wherever it's possible. And what you build is the connective tissue between all your tools and technology. And there may be a few things you have to build because nobody out there is, maybe is building string management that plays beautifully with your tool set. Or the way that you need to connect all of your internal tools, that's usually a fairly specific activity. So I think you buy everything you can, you build what you must, and you connect it all beautifully, and that's typically where your build energy is. That's my view on that. And there will always be some things that are not perfect in that buy solution. And so sometimes you may have some little utility or exception management stuff that you have to build on the side to manage for the things that standard cloud solution just does not do. So that's where your build energy goes. I think that the greatest gap that I've seen over the years when I've inherited built solutions is nobody went shopping. Nobody went shopping and went looking for what does this and started actually really seeing what was out in the marketplace. They assumed since they'd not seen it, they needed to build it. And some companies have a build it mindset, so there are certain couple companies in my past that had if not in this house, will not buy, so we built it, we did not buy. I think some of some of those big companies. And so those places have that mindset where it's your own tech or it's nothing at all. If you're in one of those situations, probably you actually have to work incredibly hard to buy something.
All right. So the next question is also kind of related in terms of automation's pretty hot these days in terms of conversations, and there are some real significant advances happening in our industry right now around automation. And and there's still even a little bit of controversy around some of it. So what role should automation play in your opinion? And maybe some examples of where you've seen it used successfully, and if you want to go there, where it's unsuccessful.
I can go with Loy if you want.
Go for it.
Automation is key for us. I mentioned my team is super small, so whenever possible, it makes sense we automate. And I heard a talk, it was called Automate or Die recently. I love it. And I learned that 50% of opportunities to automate are being missed in companies today. And there is a formula, sort of like the 3V rules to select what you should automate. If you have high volume, so tasks that are super time consuming, high volume, low variance, so it's easy to create standards. And if it costs a lot, like high resource costs to do it, those are the three things that you should take into consideration when you are choosing to automate. And I can tell you a story that happened here with our team. We had a TMS before, so it's not like we didn't have a TMS, but it wasn't working well. So in 2019, we chose to change TMSs. And with the new TMS, two things happened. One is that we cut costs in engineering because with the old TMS, our vendors didn't want to use the online experience was really bad. So what they were doing is that they were downloading, they had to prep the files and they were putting into their systems, our vendors. And we were paying for engineering costs for that. So terrible. Time, we would lose a day just for them to prep the files, to put into their systems. Terrible. So we no longer have that cost and we no longer have that time loss. And then the second thing is that we've removed our localization PMs from being the middleman between our translation vendors and our reviews vendor. And now everything is done within the tool where we were able to cut 50% of emails. Can you imagine? Because with every language and every review, there was this email, okay, file is ready, go. What a waste of time. We automated all that. There is no more communication between the translation vendor and the review. We don't need our PMs to do that anymore. So that's the story I have.
I love the 3 rules. I love those and just couldn't agree with you more. I think, I always sort of feel like aspirationally our goal should be to strive to automate 80% of our handoffs. That's just the number that you put out there. 80% of the handoffs with your internal teams, 80% of the handoffs with your vendors. So you allow for the 20% of it's new, it's an exception, it's not standard business, it's not, or it needs to be sussed out before you figure out how to automate around it. That doesn't mean that there's not a need for people. I think the need for people is to do good mind work and not point and click and grabbing files and dumping them in there and validating that the files, are the right stuff. So to me, there's such a huge opportunity to automate the part of the job that is not rewarding, compelling, interesting, or stretching the human mind. What doesn't get automated well is engagement. Finding out what's coming, talking to the upstream stakeholders, talking to the downstream stakeholders. What worked? What do we need? What do you think about the quality? I feel like our people should be way more focused on overseeing that it all works, making the right judgments and calls on what level of review or interception certain projects need. And we should be all in on automating. So our people should be shaking the hands and making it such a beautiful process with our stakeholders. The automation underneath should be making our people's jobs so much easier, as well as our partners that connect with us. So that's kind of the goal of that. So we are an augmented tech, we are a people tech business. And that, I don't see that as ever really changing. You can machine translate a lot, and you're still going to need people in there, and you're still going to need people in there making certain that the quality expectation is the right expectation for certain types of deliverables in certain circumstances. So, yay, automation.
All right. This is a term that sometimes really gets people going. So I'm just going to predicate this. There are times when I talk with people and they're like, is this going to take away my job? And granted, they're not looking at this in a larger way, but I look at it as our industry has to stop playing the role of file nanny. Mm-hmm. That's kind of harsh, right?
Yeah.
But what's more value? Hey, we want to look at this market and see what the upside is and project a budget and then work with sales towards an event. Or, I got to check and see if there's a missing curly bracket in this file, Mm-hmm. So.
Are we polishing one thing beautifully and completely missing what the customer needed, which is
right.
6 other things? So sometimes the 6 other things at a certain quality level are better than one thing that's perfect. And I think it is that perspective.
Right. Good. Okay, so we are coming to our last question. So if you haven't asked a question yet, or you've been thinking of that question, it's time to get it into the Q&A type of interface on here. So we've actually touched on this a little bit, but because it's so current, I want to go back to it just one last time. To what extent has COVID-19 impacted globalization planning?
Do you want to start that one, Silvia?
Sure, I can. I love the image.
I know the image is great. It's. Did you find that image online, Adam, or did you create that one?
I found that one actually.
That's pretty good.
I'll just bring it back. Yeah, I cracked up when I found that.
It's pretty good.
All right, so back to planning. Like in a lot of cases, there was no time for planning. Maybe it was chaos. You had a plan, it went down the drain. And I saw the example of Zoom. I saw the presentation from Zoom, and he said that they went overnight from 10 million daily participants to 300 million around the globe. Can you imagine?
Would you want to be in IT at that company? Maybe not.
You were reacting. You were prioritizing what needs to get done, and you drop all the beautiful things that we like to do. It's just like chaos. And I tell you a story that happened to us. Okay, so we had to create 2 global virtual conferences for the first time ever. We had never worked with the events team because our events were always in person. And we had to quickly learn from one another how to work together. And we had 3 months to select a platform, create the content, record, edit, 25 sessions, transcribe, localize into 8 languages, QA, and sign off. It was just insane. And on top of that, a lot of us were dealing with our own, homeschooling children or caring for parents or whatever was happening in your house. We're in the midst of it. In the time frame, April, May, June, those are the 3 months that my life I had no life. That's all I did. And so did my team and everybody that was involved. And on top of that, we had to, 6 of the sessions, they were called focus sessions. We localized the slides, and we also transcribed the English. We did MT for the transcription, because what we did next is that we recorded the sessions in the countries with SCs speaking the local language. But we did MT for the transcription just to help them, guide them, but they could create their own dialogue. It was super localized, and we had the slides localized for them. And we also did all the outbound communication and a survey at the end. So that was the whole package. But it was crazy. It was fast and furious, but it was such a beautiful experience. I really enjoyed, as crazy as it might sound, because we feel like we really delivered a truly global experience to our customers. And we followed the sun, where the conference started, with the different time zones. And in the end, we won from the platform that we use for the events. We're on 24, and Juniper won the Best Globalization of an Event award last year. And then our big team, there are a lot of people in the marketing team that helped create those 2 conferences, but the core team won a CEO award. So that was super, super gratifying for my team and the people that participated. It was not just localization. There were a lot of people involved in this event, but it was just very gratifying to all of us.
Very cool. Very cool. From my view, I have a couple thoughts on this. One would be sort of the similar sort of personal story. I look at localization always as being a flex valve for whatever company we are employed by. So if there are extra dollars and the extra dollars need to be spent by a team that is not going to incur recurring costs like headcount. Localizations, is one of those rare places, typically in a development organization, that can do an awful lot of work without hiring a bunch of people. So this last year, with COVID, the travel budget, pretty much evaporated, but all that money's in the books and all that money's in the plans. And companies don't want to have to reset everything in terms of expectations with the street. So I basically had 2 quarters of profound flex spend to try to spend with my vendors on products that needed to be done and content and things that needed to be done. And normally, you always have kind of some stuff on the bench. So if there's extra funds, you can get those things done so that, you are never wasting a penny of your planned budget. But this was like, my OKRs were about how to basically double my budget in 2 quarters and spend it all, and new vendors, all that. So that was very exciting. And I can tell you, the team would tell you, it's a lot harder work to spend money than it is to save money. It's exhausting stuff. So I think that was a unique thing that hit us with COVID. And it certainly, pointed to the necessity of building that as a really strong muscle. Like, what could I do if I have a month's leeway? What could I do if I have 2 months planning, 3 months planning, 4 months planning? To have that level of bench out there so that you're closing the gap with customer needs for localization, and you're not just doing stupid stuff, you're doing good stuff. So that was us personally. I have friends in lots of different spaces in the industry, and I feel like, I think this is true for both Silvia and I, we're in fortunate sweet spot in the part of tech that we're in that hasn't had a big impact with COVID. I have friends who worked for companies like Ticketmaster, and they're not in those jobs anymore because those jobs aren't there right now because there's no tickets being sold to anything. And so no need to translate, right? And other friends who are in the medical profession whose work has so exploded in the year that they couldn't even comprehend what was going to happen to them over the year. So I think we've seen, like, across our industry, I think there's been a huge flex, adjusting to where suddenly there's more work than there ever was, and suddenly there's no work. So I think the planning side of it, you should have a vendor person on this call, Adam, on the services side of the business, because I think these are the guys that are like, whoa, talk about a business pivot this last year.
Right. Well, as I'm not a localization vendor, but as a technology vendor, I will tell you that I was pretty worried in particularly when March. We talked about this last night. I actually had kind of a pretty wise advisor give me a heads up that this was going to be a big deal in January. So I started planning for it. And, you start putting together doomsday scenarios of, like, all this business goes away and your recurring revenue goes away and all that. And so you start bracing for it. But the reality is everybody hung on to systems, but it was very much of a we don't know what's coming. I think everybody's been surprised in most of tech, like, hey, this is not 2008, where there was a financial crisis and everything, needed a regrouping. That wasn't the case with COVID, which was, really a delightful surprise. We're very lucky. We're not, of course, if you're tech services, restaurants, or, as you said, Ticketmaster, yeah. It's a very different story. And that's held pretty nicely. And in fact, we had a pretty decent year. It wasn't our best growth year, but it was a growth year, which really, like, if you ask me that in March, is this going to be a growth year? I was like, no, I just want to, like, I just want to be in the black at the, if I could be, like, in the red. Yeah. It's like, if I could be in the red only a little bit, and like, who knew? So anyway, I want to get to the Q&A here. And within that Q&A, we already have a few questions. I'm going to mention that always, like when I attend these things, the thing ends and I was like, God, I should have asked that. So if you have a question, I'll be the arbiter of further questions. My email is really easy to remember, adam@lingoport.com. I'll answer it and I'll channel it to either Silvia, Loy, or both, depending upon what you ask me to. And that way I'm not putting them on the spot and putting their emails in the internet. They get a lot of vendor calls, I'm sure. All right, so let's go to audience questions. Multilingual folks, I'm going to let you be the arbiters of questions.
Sure.
If I should be reading them, just let me know.
Adam, this is Nika from Multilingual. Adam,
Okay.
You're welcome to read them. If you prefer for us to go through the chat, we can also do that.
Okay, I can do it just as well. I actually didn't expect the Q&A to be this easy for me to read. This is awesome. Okay, so I'm going to start. I've got 3 from the Q&A and 3 from the chat. So that's fine. I remember the chat was the very first question, so I'm going to go in that order. The first one is, do you believe that not only products or services are important to localization, but support as well? Not thinking only in sales, but post-sales as well, which is becoming more important in the last year, especially with social media. So we have support, post-sales, customer success is another term for that, and social media. There's actually three elements to that.
Yeah, I do. I think the solutions are not always the exact same solutions. So sometimes you can get away with machine translations in a lot of instances and support. And sometimes you can also get away with forums and community that speak the local language. So you may not have to do it all the deepest way that you might do product or say marketing. But I absolutely believe that. I think if for no other purpose than that, you want referenceable customers and you might care about your client satisfaction. So I think those things matter, but they may not need the same solution.
All right.
I agree. I think we need to look to also think of support, and support is an area that I find it easier to prove the ROI of the localization, because with support you can sort of estimate how many calls, because calling support and then having a person answer the phone is very expensive. Mm-hmm. So proving that with online localized, a lot of these customers are calling because they find everything in English, right? So if you were to provide the localization of the web pages or the knowledge base, then you could deflect a lot of these calls, and you could estimate that maybe you will deflect 10%, and you can show, look, if you're deflecting 10% of the calls just by localizing this content, then this is how much you're going to save. This is how much it costs to localize. Then you have an ROI, and does it make sense for your company? So I like the support story and how we can show it's a little bit easier than when we're trying to do website or
I would agree with you on that.
All right. We got a compliment here. I read compliments. Phenomenal strategy insight. Thank you. You're welcome. All right, good. I'm glad you like it. All right. In terms of costs of localization, do you think it's possible / feasible to budget the costs according to the market size? Even though there's a lot to this question here. Even though the amount of work that needs to be done in each market is practically the same, for example, budget more for the bigger market and in proportionally smaller for secondary markets. This also means clients pay local talents less when the market has not been matured, and increase to reward the talents when the market grows. There's a lot of mouthful there to take in. Let's first budget according to budget the cost according to market size.
So my first thought on this is there is a role for tiering. For what is considered your A markets, what is the investment that you give to an A market versus the investment that you give to a B market and a C market. And usually maybe it's software, depending upon what it is you deliver. I think what you have to look at for your lesser markets are what is the minimum deliverable for those lesser markets, and then look at your costs comparatively. And also allow for a certain number of customers or a certain period of time in which to recoup, break even, and actually make more than you're spending, certainly in those markets. So, I think that's the pragmatic answer to that, is break down what's really critical and put a hard eye on that, because we tend to think everything's critical in our space because we care about what we do. But put a hard eye on that and what is actually really critical in those markets until they prove to a certain level that then they can afford to carry more of your cost.
Okay. Anything to add there, Silvia?
Agree. I just want to share one, when we talk about tiers and we're talking about the website, we have a concept that, we have the full-blown website, which is the US. And then for some of the tier 1, you copy meaning like you localize pretty much all the pages, you create a big website. And then we go for a catalog version, which you have a lot of pages too, but it's a smaller version. And then you go to a brochure site version, which is a much, much smaller website than the other languages, but you still have some presence, you have a contact number, you have the homepage with some local things, but you don't do much because it's maybe a tier 2 or 3 down the line. So.
All right. Well, we are getting more customer questions here. I'm trying to go in order. It's 17 after the hour, so we have 13 minutes. All right. How might you recommend that newcomers interested in this engaging strategic aspect of globalization find meaningful localization roles? I've been to many events, yet most panels I've seen focus on career progression within the vendor LSP sector. Interesting. How could whippersnappers with multilingual, multicultural experience develop the experience valued by clients who consider aspects such as yourself? I'm curious how you build your career trajectory within localization, yet my observation has been that many junior roles, 2 to 5 years, that allow engagement and considerations you gave are in marketing or perhaps product.
So my hit on this is, okay, so I'm old and I earned all those gray hairs. Some of this comes through experience and walking different paths. So like the strategy is not going to come to you instantly, I would say, as a starter in the career. Mentorship is valuable. Seek and find mentors. That is a good course to go through. You will learn more if you have, in terms of strategy, if you have a broader experience over an area than if you are in a niche. So if you're starting out and you focus in a large company in a small niche role, you have a longer path towards getting a strategic viewpoint. If you started out with a smaller company but actually owned more strategy in terms of what that company was doing, you might catch strategy sooner in your career, but you also don't have as many people to learn from, and you may not go as deep. So I would say if you look at your career as, first of all, do what you love, do what you're passionate about, and if you really do love strategy, then make choices as you go in your career that allow you to move around appropriately and get different experiences from different sides of the industry. So, you learn the industry itself on the vendor side, right? You learn a lot about it, but you learn what's really essential and needful on the customer side in terms of what those businesses are driving for and where localization fits in that picture. So I would say at least get a grounding before you reach out for strategy, or you will not have strategy with a foundation. That would be my hit. You know, get a grounding, then get different experience. And from that, you'll start to develop a more strategic view.
I love what you said, Loy, about, the experiencing smaller companies where you're sort of everything. You're the only person and you sort of have to do everything, and you learn a lot that way, but you don't have anyone to learn from. And then you are in a bigger company where your role might be very focused, but then you have other people that you can reach out and learn from. Mentoring, agree 100%. I also think that if you're interested, you can get some business acumen classes where you just go online. There is free classes out there in different platforms that you can learn about business and how to talk to executives. I love strategy. I have an MBA, but not everybody needs one. And I know that a lot of the programs now have business classes within the Linguist program. MIST is one that it added classes to give people some business acumen so that they can do ROIs and create business cases to try to sell their projects and get the funding that they need. But there is a lot of things online as well that you can look at and study for free. Don't have to.
All right. I particularly love this question because I actually haven't seen it asked before in one of these. So that's something brand new. You both didn't mention it, but you're both very involved in it. I'll add, you can join Women in Localization whether you're a woman or not.
Us. It's true. Get community. Yeah, build community. Get to know people. That will broaden you. That's just so obvious, right?
Right.
And we do have a mentorship program that Laura runs.
We do. In fact, have such a thing, and you can sign up for that.
Yeah.
So I do think, get yourself out there in the industry, and that'll make a big difference.
All right, neat. Okay, we are running out of time, but I have more questions. So let's try to bang them out here. Again, in time sequence, Lloyd, do you think the mindset of not shopping for new solutions, in quotes, is still common? Have you seen the lack of searching for solutions across startups as well?
I do think it's still common. I think this is what I think is at the root of it. The more in the world you are, or the more, by in the world I mean the more in your industry that you are, the more likely you are to know what's out there, right? So are you going to conferences? Are you, attending webinars? Are you in your industry? If you're in your industry, you've probably stumbled across a lot of the tools that are out there. If you are not in your industry, if you are in a hidey hole and just focusing on what your company wants you to do and your team, there's a very good chance you have no idea what solutions are out there. So I think the answer to this has everything to do with whether or not the organization has focus and the team that you're in or your company supports engagement to know what's going on in the industry. Because if you know what's going on, you know where to go hunt. And you have at least half a dozen people to ask them about, hey, what solutions have you seen for this problem? So that's my thought on that. I think it has everything to do with how in the world you are within your company and personally and within your organization.
All right. I from personal experience on that question, an awful lot of people, first of all, there's knowing what to search for. Our industry throws around a lot of terms like, say internationalization, which another person might call translation. Translation is a diluted word on the internet, right? So you search in translation, it's like, I can't find what I need, right? It happens all the time. the thing I'll add to that is one of the things that localization often has to endure is that developers, and I'm being stereotypical here, by nature are a expert culture. So developers prove themselves by their expertise. And so a developer looks at something that they need, and right away, the way that many of them are wired is, I could write that this weekend. Right? But they're not thinking of all the extenuating circumstances, and it's like a rabbit hole. Once you go into it, now you're not writing it this weekend, right? So it is something as localization professionals we have to be aware of and work through in our own organizations, that there are expert cultures that also look to prove themselves by how much money they think they can save, like it's the save mentality versus the revenue opportunity that Loy is talking about. Like speed is really important, and change over time and maintenance and scale start to be important, right? But anyway, so that's something I've just observed. It's not always the dominant thing, and it's easily conquerable. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to just move on. This is our last question, and it's a three-parter, and we only have 4 minutes. So we're going to have to be like super fast. To both Loy and Silvia, what is your team's involvement with product localization as opposed to content and marketing? I'm going to start with that one. Really quick answers.
I'm not involved, so Loy, you take that one, because my team is trying to get involved, but we're not. So okay. Loy, why don't you take that one?
So I would say that it's collaborative space for my team. And when I think of product localization, I think of feature functionality, things like, VAT, GST, multi-currency, that kind of stuff when I think of it that way. I'm not sure that's how the question was meant, but that's typically the realm of product. If there's a global product owner, that's typically the realm of them. And we are usually tight, strong collaborators, and often the team that points out when the emperor has no clothes, right? Like, oops, I think we weren't thinking this one through. We look like a US company to our customers in these markets. So I see that we have a role in collaboration, in partnership, and sometimes as the team that goes first in seeing what that global experience looks like in the locale and pointing out when it's not quite right and sharing that feedback upstream. So we should be catching a lot of those failures if they happen, and in engagement with those teams as they are in the creation process. So that's assuming that the conversation was more about product localization, which is truly more the feature functionality. Is it right? And on the content side, content and localization in my org, they are, I have both sides of that. There is always some lovely synergy spaces, and then there are always areas that are just completely different. So I kind of look at the organizations as having really similar mandates, really similar kinds of people, challenges, problems, and like if they were both a triangle, there's this little area in there that's a sweet spot that both share and care about. There's certain areas around quality, terminology, certainly handoffs, that kind of thing, that there's an opportunity to collaborate and do it better.
All right, this is a three-part question, but I'm going to skip the second one because there's no way we have time for that. That's the magic wand question if other people can read it. But what is really short, all right, what is the best thing that's happened to your product localization?
It depends upon which company and where in my history. I think the first and most basic thing is getting it in language. Like, that's obvious. Like, the best thing is first getting it in language. I think the next best thing is getting it right for the customers. And I think the third best thing is getting to that place in maturity where it's not just we are English US first, we push it out, it goes into language, but when the process starts listening to local customers and starts listening to their requirements and starts actually taking in best practices and cool things that come from those markets. And so if I look back on my experience and I go back to like years ago at Google, one of the coolest things that Google did in how they grew their geo products was having a lot of the features that drove that product come from the local regions. So walking, thank you Japan. Bikes, thank you Netherlands, the bike paths. So you think about all those different things. Google would never have thought about a lot of that had they not listened to the local markets. So I think what the truly sweet spot there is when it's not just what we push, but what we pull. I think that's an amazing space, and it doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, you're working for a global company.
Bravo, bravo. Silvia, anything to add? We're like 1 minute over, but let's just go there. All right.
No, I think I said it all.
All right, good. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, folks. There were a whole bunch of folks at MultiLingual who made the underpinning for bringing this to you work. They are our unsung heroes, and they did real work to get this all together. Thank you, Silvia. Thank you, Loy, for saying yes when I reached out to you guys and carving out an important part of your day here to bring this to everybody. And thank you all to the audience for staying with us for this. Most of you, I can see the participants, most of you stayed, and those of you watching on recording, you missed it live, but I get it. Sometimes you can't do it, and I'm glad you could listen to the recording. All right, we get some thanks a million. Thank you, speakers. Thanks for an amazing session on the chat. So thank you, everybody. Take care, and there's another winter series coming up. Check multilingual.com to see the next webinar. I think, is that with Oscar? Anyway, go and join that.